Hello, I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Coming up on the virus, 5 million people in lockdown. How Australia went from being a success story to being on the edge again. Plus, Brazil's president tests positive after dismissing medical advice on containing the spread. First though, tonight, the Victorian outbreaks show no sign yet of slowing down. The state has recorded the biggest 24-hour surge in infections since the pandemic began. 288 people tested positive today, making it 5 days in a row of triple-digit increases. Victoria is now officially the most affected state. It's passed New South Wales in total confirmed cases and sits above Tasmania in infections per capita. The Greater Melbourne metropolitan area and the Shire of Mitchell are now back to stage 3 restrictions because of the rapid rise in cases. That's 5 million Australians who are again being forced to stay at home except for essential business. Community transmission is the major issue for health authorities. Those in locked down areas are now being told to wear face masks when they leave home.
We've already begun the process of getting 2 million reusable masks made, and we will be able to then distribute those throughout the community. And in the interim, that takes a little bit of time. But again, this is not something that's a week or a month. It's going to be with us for quite some time.
Well, that community transmission took hold in residential towers this week. Nearly 3,000 residents in 9 buildings were fully quarantined. 158 people have the virus. A third of them are from just one of those towers. It'll remain totally locked down for another week, but the 8 other buildings are now under the same restrictions as the rest of metropolitan Melbourne. So what are those restrictions for Melbourne and the Mitchell Shire? Well, like before, there are only 4 reasons you're allowed to leave your home: food and essentials, exercise, medical, or work and study. But unlike last time, no visitors except a partner are allowed to come to your home. And if you go outside, your group is limited to 2 people except for household members. Funerals are back to 10 people and 5 for weddings. Golf and fishing are among the recreational activities okay this time, but you're not allowed to leave your local area. The lockdown has prompted other states and territories to close their borders to arrivals from Victoria. Most will not allow Victorian residents in, even if they quarantine for 14 days. For New South Wales, it's meant closing its southern border for the first time in more than 100 years. There are major national freight corridors between the 2 states, so enforcing the shutdown is a massive logistical effort. Josh Bavis takes a look.
There are close to 55 ground crossings, including the Hume and Princess highways. The Hume alone typically has about 10,000 vehicles crossing every day. About 1,000 defence personnel and police will be deployed, making sure everyone coming into New South Wales is checked. Even drones will be used to make sure no one crosses illegally by foot. While it may be disruptive, there will be exemptions if you need to get across.
There will be queues, there will be frustration, there will be lots of questions, but we're doing this to keep everybody safe.
Exemptions will be made for those living in a border town, freight drivers, emergency services, fly-in, fly-out workers, or on compassionate grounds. Crossing the border without a permit could land you with a fine of $11,000 or jail time, with on-the-spot fines of $1,000 for lying on a form.
Well, it's not just interstate travel that's being affected. National Cabinet has agreed to cut the rate of international arrivals by just over half. It means Australia will now only allow about 4,000 citizens and permanent residents back into the country each week. States will also start charging returned travellers for mandatory hotel quarantine. A nationwide review of the quarantine system is also being launched.
Making sure that as we look into each of the states and territories and how they're managing their quarantine, that it is meeting the standards that the AHPPC have advised upon. And as our country opens up again, with the exception of Victoria, that we can ensure we have even greater confidence in those quarantine arrangements as they're being put in place.
The developments this week are a reminder of just how quickly infection rates can pick back up. Earlier I spoke with our national medical reporter Sophie and Professor Bruce Thompson, the Dean of Health Sciences at Swinburne University.
So the cases will still go up for a while because we still need to find them all, But once we actually, the social distancing processes that we're doing in terms of stage 3 lockdown, we'll eventually see we'll flatten that curve out again, and then we'll start seeing a decrease. And I think the other thing to worry about is we're doing a lot of testing. So we'll find more virus. I suppose the interesting question is the actual hit rate that we're actually getting and whether that's staying the same or in fact going up a little bit.
So what is the hit rate with that testing right now? And a lot of viewers are wondering, are people being detected as having coronavirus while not showing any symptoms?
So that can happen. There is no two ways about it. The hit rate's actually really very low. My understanding it's less than 1%, so it is very, very low. But what's actually encouraging, especially about the actual recent testing that we're doing in these hotspots, is that if you don't have any symptoms, you don't have a temperature, then it's extremely unlikely you've got the virus. Now, everyone is worried about the asymptomatic people who are carrying the viruses and what have you, and the cruise ships, definitely that was the case, because we actually demonstrated in those cruise ships that 40% of the people that actually were carriers of the virus were totally asymptomatic. But that is not what we're seeing in this group. We're actually seeing if they are asymptomatic, no temperature at all, then they actually just don't have the virus. And that's actually probably quite comforting.
Sophie, we all became familiar with this term flattening the curve earlier on in this pandemic, and I guess that's what we're seeing in Victoria now, trying to flatten the curve yet again. How long will it take for that to happen?
Look, that's a good question. The lockdown in Victoria has been announced for 6 weeks, and I think at the time that was a little bit of a surprise that it was 6 weeks. Some people might have thought it was going to be 4 weeks. But the rationale and the experts that we've spoken to said the 6 weeks was really chosen quite deliberately because that will allow a couple of life cycles of the virus to come and go and for these public health measures to be put in place to see if they're working. They can then be reviewed and extended if needed.
Sophie, one of the really interesting things over the course of this week is that borders have closed at various levels. So New South Wales went first and then South Australia's border closed, and then the New South Wales Premier said, look, we're going to have to keep people who live near the border, try to avoid travelling further into New South Wales and the ACT. At the same time, the Queensland border is opening. So there is a potential there, isn't there, that the virus has migrated at some point in those windows between Melbourne and South Australia, New South Wales, ACT, Queensland?
That's right, Jeremy. And look, even in the ACT, there's been a number of cases already that have been traced back to Victoria. And there's a case on the south coast of someone in Melbourne who thought they had a negative test, but then actually were positive. So that's, yes, already in the last few days, we've seen the virus migrate with people outside Victoria. But I think these border closures, as difficult as they are really important. And even though it's been, we've seen the pictures all week of cars queued up and borders closed and really probably things that we would never have thought that we would see in our lifetime, really, if you think about it. But it is a really important public health measure to try to ring fence and sort of put a circle around Victoria to make sure that people who might have it, who might not have symptoms, are really not going outside Victoria for any reason unless it's absolutely necessary. And I think they've really tightened up the restrictions in most states about whether Victorians can travel there. So we'll probably see less of that spread now. I'd say now that the restrictions have been tightened so much.
This issue of schools, I mean, a lot of states are on school holidays right now, but school starts going back inside the next week or the next fortnight. This issue is on the minds of a lot of people, particularly when they look at the Altaqua College in Melbourne and the spread of it there.
Yeah, well, a few things. With that college today, they did say that most of the spread of kids in that college, actually, they think they got the virus from their homes, so not from the college itself. So that's one point to make. We do know that kids don't spread the virus as much as adults do. They certainly don't get as sick. But we do know in Victoria that there has been teacher-to-teacher spread of the virus, which is a concern. So in Victoria, they've extended the school holidays for a week. But there's no sort of strong indication yet whether they will be going back, as they said they have been planning. There is still the potential of remote learning, apart from year 11 and 12 and year 10 students who are sitting the VCE or HSC. It's just on the issue of temperature screening, because they have said that kids in Victoria, when they do go back to school, will have their temperature checked.
Professor Thompson, we got this question about what the reproduction number, the R number, is. How is it calculated and what is it sitting at right now in Melbourne?
So that's it's like this magic number when these things happen. What is the number? So the reproduction number is basically if I have the virus, on average, how many other people have I given it to? So if I come home with a horrible cold, I tend to give it to the whole family. No one really likes me very much after that's happened, but how many will they normally pass it on to? If the virus is extremely virulent, you'll present it to a number of people. So if you look at smallpox, one person will give it to 26 others. Highly, highly deadly, virulent virus. If you look at influenza, on average, it gives it to about 2.5 people, maybe 2 people, depending on where you are. And that seems to be roughly the number that we're getting in with corona as well. Corona is still classified as a mild virus, believe it or not. But the issue is it's got the sweet spot. So it doesn't kill the host very quickly. It doesn't pass it to a huge number of people, but it passes it on to just enough, and it doesn't necessarily kill the host. So it's roughly around about, my understanding in Victoria, it's sitting around about 2.5. So one person will be giving it to 2.5 people. So if you've got one person with the virus, you now got 3.5, then you're going to multiply by that by 2.5, and you can see how it exponentially increases. So it's a concern. And what we wanted is to be that number to be less than 1, because that means one person is not giving it to anyone else. So we did get to that point, but now it's escalating again. And if we look in other areas like the US or Brazil or whatever, it's going to be a lot higher than that number.
Sophie, you've done some work this week on catching up with some of the science that's evolving around the longer-term effects of coronavirus. We get this question week to week to week, and the science does seem to evolve week to week to week. What are we learning about the long-term effects on other parts of the body for people who do carry the virus?
Yeah, so we wanted to look at what happens after you're over the acute elements of the virus. And what they've found, and this is primarily overseas research, because we haven't really had enough cases in Australia to be seeing this here, which is, again, a good thing. But what they're seeing overseas is that what happens with coronavirus and COVID-19 is that, particularly in the second week of the illness, your body, you have very, very high levels of inflammation in the body. And then your immune system tries to shut that down. And so you go into what they call a cytokine storm, which is all this stuff floating around in your body. And it can destroy and damage a number of organs. And we looked at the organs it can damage, not only your lungs, causing scarring, it can cause damage to the heart and the heart muscle and inflammation of the heart. And one of the experts we spoke to said 1/3 of deaths in intensive care were due to heart failure. And then it can also cause damage to the brain, and that can be either short-term or it can be long-term as well. And so we're now seeing in the US, particularly in the UK, they're seeing people who've recovered from the virus in terms of an acute illness, but they've got a long way until they're well. And in the UK, they're actually going to set up clinics to help people with long-term rehabilitation from having COVID-19. So we thought it was really important to let people know that this is not necessarily something that you have and get over in a week or so. And we had an amazing case study, a guy in his early 60s, an Australian guy who had the virus, and he was very, very fit and healthy, went hiking and had no risk factors apart from being in his mid-60s. And he has now has lung damage, he has heart damage. He was in ICU for 3 weeks, and it will be at least 12 months of intense recovery and rehab for him. But the good thing about this amazing guy, Carl, is his mental attitude, and he actually works in rehabilitation, so he knows how important it is to be doing all the physical exercise. So I think even though he's got a bit of a hard road ahead, Carl, I think he's actually going to nail it because his mental attitude is just so good.
Bruce Thompson, you're a professor in cardiorespiratory medicine. This evolving science must concern you as an expert in this field.
Look, it really does. And it's interesting. Everyone focuses on death. What a hell of an endpoint that is. So, I'm starting to think about what happens if people get really close. They've been sitting in intensive care for quite a few days. We know that's a bad thing. Or they actually have non-invasive ventilation, so they may not be actually in intensive care. So, and we only need to look at the British Prime Minister when his first interview, when he came out of hospital. He really did not look great, and he didn't sound very good, and he just looked profoundly unwell. So the whole morbidity associated with this virus is something that we need to really start focusing on because, as I said, that's a pretty interesting endpoint. That takes a lot to get to that point. I'd be really interested in what's happening in terms of the morbidity. The whole microvascular story, I think, is quite scary. So as Sophie just beautifully said, about 1/3 of the people that died is actually of heart failure. And we'd actually think that it'd be the lungs are the ones that are giving out this whole cytokine storm that's going, your whole immune system is just going nuts, and it's just taking out organ after organ due to the inflammatory process. So I think this is actually of real concern.
Professor Bruce Thompson there with national medical reporter Sophie Scott. Let's take a look at the national picture now. You can see we're back to the same levels of infection as we had in April. The vast majority of those cases is in Victoria. Only a few other states and territories are recording new cases. Mostly they're at below 10 a day, including returned travellers. Victoria also dominates the chart of active cases, which has jumped from 450 last week to more than 1,200 this week. Again, most states and territories are virtually COVID-free, except for a few international and interstate arrivals. Adding to the concerns about community transmission this week is the latest research, which shows airborne transmission is a very real risk. Our science reporter Michael Slezak explains.
It's the distance we've been told to keep from each other, 1.5 metres, our own personal safety zone. But what is really concerning some scientists now is the potential for airborne spread. Some studies have shown that when people sneeze, droplets containing the virus can be propelled up to 8 metres. Even a cough can take them 6 metres. They can then land on you, or they can land on surfaces that you then touch. That person you saw sneezing, they've expelled both large and small droplets. Larger ones are likely to drop and dissipate quickly, but the smaller ones, called aerosols, do not. Aerosols, droplets less than 1/10 the thickness of a human hair, can be suspended for minutes or hours, and floating inside is the virus.
And in an indoor setting, these then, kind of hover around in an aerosol cloud. They don't easily disperse.
If true, large buildings could be highly vulnerable to fast spreading of the virus. Aerosols even have the potential to infiltrate ventilation systems, travelling from floor to floor.
During the SARS-1 epidemic in 2003, it spread from one infected person in an apartment block to multiple floors on that apartment block.
Many experts say this fear is being overblown.
The overwhelming body of evidence suggests that the primary mode of COVID-19 getting from one person to another is larger droplets.
But others worry what airborne transmission means for people in the Melbourne towers.
There are operators of this building who can immediately trace the possible directions of the transmission. And this is what the individuals in these towers should do.
So far, there have been no confirmed cases of coronavirus infection via aerosols. But after hundreds of scientists wrote to the World Health Organization demanding they revisit the evidence, they are now reviewing their guidance.
Globally, America is still bearing the brunt of the infections and deaths. More than 12 million cases have now been recorded there, and more than 550,000 people have died. The outbreaks in India and Russia also being closely watched. As you just saw, the United States has now recorded more than 3 million cases of infection, and that gives it the undesirable position of being the worst affected country on earth. It also set a new record this week with 65,000 new cases in just one 24-hour period. More than 133,000 people have died. Despite the growing numbers, the White House wants to press ahead with school reopenings. Meanwhile, the Brazilian president, who's been criticised for being blasé about coronavirus, has now contracted the disease himself. Jair Bolsonaro continues to brush off the health risks, even though more than 65,000 people in his country have died.
Telling reporters to stand back, President Bolsonaro announced he's tested positive to COVID-19.
You can see from my face that I'm well and I'm calm. Thanks to God, I'm fine.
This is the man who described the virus as like a little flu. He's no fan of the mask and has repeatedly told Brazilians not to worry.
Life goes on. Brazil has to produce. We have to get the economy going.
The president made light of his infection, crediting the controversial anti-malarial drug hydroxychloroquine for his mild symptoms, even though it's not proven effective against COVID-19. 1.6 million Brazilians have now been infected with coronavirus, yet the Brazilian president continues to downplay the severity of the pandemic. But there's no ignoring the 65,000 dead and increasing every day.
Well, thanks for your company on the virus this week. Stay safe. See you again soon.